Our guest says the U.S. military pivot to Asia is a lot more about rhetoric than anything concrete and real. Christian Whiton, principal at policy think tank and consultancy DC International Advisory, is with us on the show today. Hello, Christian. Good afternoon. So why is it rhetoric and not real? I mean, they're pointing more guns. The ships are sailing closer. They've been sitting down with the Filipinos, Prime Minister Noda, and there's a lot going on. There are going to be more boots on the ground here.
Right, Bernie, it's a lot of glitter, but not a lot of real change. You know, if you look at the deployment, the big change in the so-called pivot has been the deployment of up to 2,500 U.S. Marines in Darwin, Australia. That's 3,700 miles from Beijing, in a theater where the things that really matter are naval and air power. If you look at what we're doing here in Singapore, it's going to be 2 literal combat ships that aren't actually built yet. You know, these things aren't really significant when you think about projecting power in the Pacific and East Asia. And the Chinese, more than anyone, can look at naval procurement, Air Force procurement in the U.S., the so-called defense sequestration that's supposed to kick in January. And they can see that the U.S. military is set to get a lot smaller, and that's what really matters.
So why did the president make such a big deal out of it? I mean, turning it into a big policy initiative, talking about, winding down efforts in the Middle East and then shifting the attention to Asia. You're saying this was a paper-up or a cover-up for the fact that there are cuts and there's austerity going on in the military?
I wouldn't call it a cover-up. I just say it's being politically astute. It might be a little mendacious on the president's part, but you have an administration that basically has withdrawn from the world in order to stage a domestic revolution in the United States of sorts. You have precipitous withdrawal from Iraq. There was supposed to be a long-term relationship that had, if necessary, a presence of U.S. forces in Iraq to stabilize the situation there. That went by the wayside, and it's happening now in Afghanistan. So, the administration knows that Americans like to think of themselves as an exceptional nation. And if you look at their history, I think we have been an exceptional nation. But, so you can't just appear to be another Jimmy Carter. And I think the administration has been conscious of that risk. So you have these things. How do you make up for that? You say, oh, well, if we're not focusing on the Middle East, we must be focusing on Asia. But as I say, not much of a military muscle, and also not a whole lot of political action as far as pushing back seriously on Beijing's real transgressions, which have a lot more to do with security than they do about currency issues, frankly.
Christian, there are myriad overlapping claims of sovereignty. I mean, the whole South China Sea is just littered with them. I mean, China, for its own part, claims most of the South China Sea as its marine borders, and yet the United States has stood by its line quite consistently that they don't get involved in bilateral or even multilateral Asian disputes. That they're an observer in this case. What does this mean? That the United States is a paper tiger? I mean, they're just kind of standing by. They've got ships and, naval officers and enlisted men going into ports of call, but really they don't have any doctrine, no policy doctrine for any real action as per the disputes that are on display here.
Well, I think the U.S. Navy is doing the best it can, and our Pacific Command commander is doing the best he can with very vague instructions in support from Washington. But yeah, you have these competing claims, but we also need to make a judgment of who has the better claim, and certainly we should bias our decision towards those who are not being the aggressor militarily. You have what happened recently, the kerfuffle between the Philippines and China. That was within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. You had last year an incident where a Chinese naval ship damaged a Vietnamese survey ship. That was within Vietnam's exclusive economic zone, and you have these disputes with China and Japan as well. These are either our allies or at least countries which are not acting in a manner that's adversarial to U.S. interests and adversarial to the interests of a secure order in East Asia. So we ought to be intervening more, siding more, especially with the Philippines, which, because of its economic situation and because the choices it's made on defense, cannot really defend itself. It has, a fairly small economy. If you look at the other larger nations nearby, it spends less than 1% of its GDP on defense. And the ships it sent to, confront these Chinese fishing vessels which were operating illegally in the Philippines were really not adequate to face up to anything China can field.
But it sounds, Christian, that what you're advocating here is what China would easily interpret as an aggressive policy. I do note that what we're talking about here comes at a time when the Obama administration, which previously just said they were going to repaint and buff up some of the aging F-16s in the Taiwan Air Force, now they're actually talking about selling new hardware to the Taiwanese. This is the kind of stuff that really, really ticks off and cheeses off China.
It is. It's very interesting how we're managing to capture their ire and incur all of the downside of tumultuous relations with Beijing with none of the upside. You know, we ought to improve the capabilities. It's actually in our law, the Taiwan Relations Act, to sell Taiwan the weapons it needs for its own self-defense. So we ought to be selling, frankly, more of the F-35, or at least the most advanced version of the F-16. We ought to be fielding, we ought to have an integrated command with our allies, more than just occasional practice with the Philippines military, which frankly is not going to be much use outside of the counterinsurgency, counterterror field within the Philippines itself. We ought to be continuing to cajole Japan along, but we're doing none of those things. So we're getting all the downside, but none of the upside that would actually put Beijing back in a box.
Christian, great talking to you. Your comments I could see making some of the boots quake in Beijing. Christian Whiton joined